Mhm. So is that a big reason why you compare our current environment to the 1940s a lot?
Yeah, that's basically the culmination of the long-term debt cycle based
Mhm.
on Ray Dalio's work, and I've kind of looked at the data independently and come to similar conclusions based on the inspiration from his work. And basically, what that does, so this whole system that we've built, this whole credit-based system, this fiat-based system, is basically based on the premise that debt as a percentage of GDP keeps going up. That's what fuels all this, part of the growth that we have, and that works as long as interest rates keep going down. And so from say the 80s to the present, you had interest rates going structurally down, even as debt as a percentage of GDP went structurally up. And so your interest payments never really went up as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of disposable income. So it wasn't really harder to support that debt. It's kind of like how if you have a house, you get a mortgage on it. If the house, if you're buying a house today, it might be twice as expensive as it was decades ago, but the mortgage rate might be half of what it was,
Mhm.
especially before this recent increase in mortgage rates. And so that makes it, relatively easy to afford the same house, despite the fact that you've had, uh, you know, maybe higher house and higher mortgage to rate to income ratios. Same thing for government, same thing for corporations. And so the problem happens, of course, when you run into the zero bound, when or even slightly negative in Europe's case, where you basically get to a point where you cannot raise interest rates any lower. You start turning to fiscal stimulus whenever there's recessions, and then at the point where interest rates go flat to up, it gets harder and harder to service those debts when debt is as a percentage of GDP is that high, and so they basically turn to the same thing they did in the 40s, and it's kind of what we're seeing now, where you have inflation officially of over 8%, and they're raising rates from zero at 25 or 50 basis points a time, multiple weeks apart, and kind of lagging that inflation by quite a bit. And I think that's pretty much by design because they know. I mean, if they just came out and said, "Hey, we're gonna bring rates up to 9% tomorrow," you'd have an epic crash, right? So because there's so much debt in the system, pretty much everybody would be insolvent at those types of interest rates. And so they're kind of hoping that these marginal increases, this marginal tightening, is enough to do it. And I don't think it will be ultimately, but I think that's the environment we're in. Where we're going to have persistently negative real rates. Now, there could be periods of time, like very brief periods of time, where you have some sort of deflationary bust, and then you briefly have positive real rates. But I think for the most part, just kind of like looking back over the past decade, I think looking back at the end of this decade, we're going to be on average in negative real rate territory.
Mhm. So, when we think about the deflationary forces and how threatened central banks are by, these deflationary busts, like you just said, are there both good and bad examples of deflation that we can see in the world?
Well, good deflation is from technology and productivity increases.
Mhm.
Basically, over time, the long arc of history is that especially in the past 200 to 300 years, we've tapped into these denser energy sources, and basically, we don't really realize it, but the amount of energy we consume, we basically have like a dozen humans working for us every day in terms of energy output, right? So, you know, the amount of energy it takes to power your house and run your car and build a lot of the electronics and other things used on a daily basis, that takes multiple humans worth of energy, kind of working for you all the time. That's the equivalent of what people in developed markets have.
Mhm.
And so combined with what we've seen in electronics in particular and other areas, there's good types of deflation. I mean, in a low debt environment, deflation is what we want. We want things to get cheaper over time as a result of us being able to more efficiently make them.
Mhm.
And so that's the good type of deflation. The bad type of deflation is when you basically have a debt bubble, and that debt bubble starts to collapse. And so you basically get a collapse in demand. And then you get, basically you're left with oversupply. That's kind of what we had over the past decade, where you build up new supply, and then you had a reduction in demand, and then you're left with, this oversupply. And so that's kind of a bad type of deflation, especially because that generally results in high unemployment and just recessionary economic conditions in general. And I think that a lot of modern economists will view deflation as always bad, but that's because they're looking at it through this lens of constant credit expansion, constant debt expansion, fiat systems. That's kind of based on the premise that they want low and positive inflation and constant debt increases. But in other systems, deflation would be a good thing.
Mhm. So the Fed is hoping to engineer a soft landing for the markets here. But if we have too strong of a deflationary shock or multiple shocks, could that lead to a much worse outcome if we start to see a cycle of defaults accelerate? And if that starts to happen, could that be the trigger for the Fed to reverse course?
I think so. I mean, soft landings are historically pretty rare. If you look back at the number of Fed tightening cycles over the past, 50, 60, 70 years, their ability to engineer quote unquote soft landings is pretty low. Um, there might have been a couple cases where you can kind of call it one of those, but for the most part, you just get recession.
Mhm.
I think the best they can hope for maybe is a mild recession. Because the problem, of course, and I've said this a number of times, is that the Fed can't print oil, they can't print chips, they can't print copper, they can't print houses. And so I think this is only resolved with bring online new energy sources, bring online new manufacturing shipping capacity, and that takes time and that takes capital and that takes aligned incentives. And so right now, for example, oil futures priced out 3, 4, 5 years are actually pretty cheap. The market still thinks a lot of this is transitory. And so if you're an energy producer, are you going to want to ramp up production a ton right now when
Mhm.
basically you're being told that your old industry, you're being phased out. This is just transitory. Future prices are lower. And if, by the way, if you are too profitable, we're going to do windfall taxes, right? So does a lot of new capital want to go in there right now? Around the margins, obviously energy prices are pretty high. There's some expansion happening, but it's not as though there's a flood of new supply coming online in any sort of timeline that we can see in the next 6, 12 months. And so I think that they're going to, they can reduce inflation for periods of time if they control demand enough. But I think in order to return to an environment of disinflationary growth, basically growth without very high inflation, you would need to improve the supply side. And
Mhm.
that's just not really in the cards right now.
And I'd like to get to, a lot of the problems surrounding the energy, but I'd like to finish up a couple more things with the Fed here, basically. If they keep raising rates to, let's say, 3, 4, or 5%, what would happen to the dollar and by extension, the countries that have a lot of dollar denominated debt in that scenario?
So that partially depends on what's happening with other currencies. So some of the stronger emerging markets have front run the Fed. And so they started raising rates, well over a year ago.
Mhm.
Many of them have positive real rates, actually, way higher than the Fed. And some of them have a lot of reserves relative to how much, say, external liabilities they have. And so I think those would weather it pretty well. I mean, they would have to tighten. That can put themselves into a recession. But I think they can get through that. I think the problem areas are ones where their external liabilities exceed their reserves. An example would be Turkey, um, and ones that are not raising rates to basically attract foreign capital, above their level of interest, above their level of inflation, and so it makes their currency undesirable. Again, Turkey is an example of this, but there are others. And so I do think this is a dangerous environment for a number of those weaker emerging markets that don't have the reserves or the positive real rates to basically become a carry trade.
Mhm.
And then as for the dollar itself, I mean you're comparing it to Europe and Japan and these other major currencies. I think that the dollar is going to strengthen, or at least be neutral relative to them, especially if they continue this hiking cycle. Um, but that it's not necessarily going to strengthen compared to the strongest currencies out there, the ones with the huge current account surpluses, the ones with positive real rates, or at least less negative real rates. So I think it's something you have to look at on a currency by currency basis. But certainly one of the biggest factors in global macro is the dollar. It's very hard for the world and even the U.S. to grow while the dollar is strengthening because basically what it's doing is it's kind of like quantitative tightening the whole world. The
Mhm.
unit of account that the majority of the world uses for its external debt liabilities is strengthening relative to a lot of other currencies, and so you get this kind of like tightening dynamic. And that also means generally that in strong dollar environments, the foreign sector doesn't buy that many treasuries, and that actually ends up in large part being the trigger that causes the Fed to eventually reverse. Because if the foreign sector is not buying a lot of those treasuries, it means domestic sources have to buy more of them, which means they're not buying as many stocks, and so basically you get a crowding out effect. And eventually, what happens is the Fed is has to come in and be dovish in some way. Now they could, for example, buy treasuries themselves. They could also do things like adjust the SLR rules for banks to allow banks to buy more. Um, and I think that's one of those things. It's not on the cards for the next couple months,
Mhm.
because there's not a lot of expected treasury issuance at the current moment. But I think the longer this extends, the more treasury market illiquidity and lack of demand could be a problem for them.
Right. So, Lynn, is that by, in some ways by extension, does that mean that the Fed's actions right now are really the biggest driver of where the markets are heading all around the world?
I think the Fed is certainly one of the biggest drivers. I think obviously what's happening with energy capex
Mhm.
and geopolitical issues, Russia's war. I think those are also very large factors, but certainly the Fed is one of the biggest because they have a large control of the main unit of account that is used not just in the U.S. but globally, and so that's going to be a big factor. And the issue is that most central banks, including the Fed, are basically backward-looking institutions. They don't generally have a good history of forward projecting that's accurate, and so they're usually chasing whatever is happening lately. And so right now, with official CPI as high as it is and official unemployment as low as it is, they have a clear mandate to try to, you know, decrease inflation, even if it means mildly increasing unemployment. But of course, it's very hard to do that in moderation without causing that momentum shift because job losses means that people can consume less, which means businesses don't do as well, which means they hire less, which means there's more people that aren't able to consume as much, and so you get that negative feedback cycle. That is a hard, it's hard to say increase unemployment from 3% to 5% and stop there, right?
Mhm.
That's historically a very challenging thing to do. And so I think right now they're clearly going from one direction to the other. But the problem is, I think we're later in this cycle than they realize, and so we have declining PMI, so declining Purchasing Managers Index, which basically means economic deceleration, even though it's not necessarily outright recession yet. You have very very low consumer sentiment, and so I think that these are going to be challenging for the next 6 to 12 months, and it's a very difficult environment for them to try to be hawkish in.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's kind of like I've heard you say in the past, it's more like a light switch than a dial that they can control inflation and all these other factors that you just mentioned, right?
Yeah, and that's something that Luke Groban brought up a number of times, and I agree with him on that. Basically, that the Fed still thinks this is like a dial that they can control,
Mhm.
whereas there's so much debt in the system, it's kind of like you're either growing or collapsing.
Mhm.
It's really like that kind of Boolean, that light switch outcome. And so I think right now the light switch is off, and so it's very hard for asset prices, for unemployment levels, and for consumer sentiment to do well in this type of environment.